Hello everyone, and welcome back to my series, A Fool Reads The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. And we are in Chapter 3, which is titled, Since Evil and Suffering Exist, a Loving God Cannot. And Lee Strobel finally gets into answering some of the objections that Templeton raised against Christianity. And in the style that he does it is pretty much in the same style of all his books, where he puts on the guise of a hardened skeptical reporter going out to search for answers and grill the experts and see if he can get some solutions to these problems. There's a lot to talk about in this chapter, so I'm splitting the video up, and then once I've finished all the videos covering Chapter 3, I will put them together into one long video just to have that there as well in case anyone wants to just go through the entire chapter with me and just have no breaks in between. But this video will cover the first few sections of the chapter. Strobel begins the chapter by recounting suffering in his own life, either that he's experienced or that he has witnessed personally. He talks about times when he traveled overseas, like to Bombay, India, where he saw people with missing limbs, and he describes his encounter with a child who walks up to him and the child has a disease all over his body, an eye that's just deformed by disease. We read stories like that, horrible evils like the Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the genocide of Rwanda, the torture chambers of South America. We can't help but wonder, where is God? We watch television coverage of earthquakes and hurricanes in which thousands perish, and we wonder, why didn't God stop it? Or in my case, we wonder, why did God create it or cause it? We read the statistic that 1,000 million people in the world lack the basic necessities of life, and we wonder, why doesn't God care? We may suffer ourselves with persistent pain or aching loss or seemingly hopeless circumstances, and we wonder, why doesn't God help? If He is loving, and if He is all-powerful, and if He is good, then surely all of the suffering should not exist. And yet it does. As I read the introduction to the chapter, I was getting excited, because Lee Strobel is demonstrating here a competence about the problem. He at least understands to some degree what the problem is. And we now come to his first expert, Peter John Kreeft. Lee Strobel refers to him as the unphilosopher. Not that he isn't a philosopher. In fact, he's a first-rate philosophical thinker, with a doctorate from Fordham University, postgraduate study at Yale University, and 38 years of experience as a philosophy professor at Villanova University and, since 1965, Boston College. He has written such books as Love is Stronger Than Death, Heaven the Heart's Deepest Longing, Prayer, The Great Conversion, A Refutation of Moral Relativism, and Handbook of Christian Apologetics. Strobel begins right away by questioning Kreeft on Templeton's main objection that he brought up, mainly the woman in the photograph holding her dead baby in Africa, and how Templeton said it's impossible for there to be a loving God when all that was needed was rain to spare this woman all that suffering and agony of losing her child. So he asked Kreeft how he would respond to that. And he says, "I'd focus on his words. It is not possible. Even David Hume, one of history's most famous skeptics, said it is just barely possible that God exists. That's at least a somewhat reasonable position, to say that there's at least a small possibility. But to say there's no possibility that a loving God, who knows far more than we do, including about our future, could possibly tolerate such evil as Templeton sees in Africa, well, that strikes me as intellectually arrogant." And I actually agree with Kreeft on that point. I don't think Templeton is warranted in his conclusion that there cannot be a loving God with these sorts of things happening, because there's always the chance that there's a good reason why God allows this suffering. We as humans are limited in our knowledge, and we need to be careful about that when we draw conclusions. I think Templeton is warranted in saying, it seems like there is not a loving God because of all the evil and suffering in the world, or I can't think of any reason why there would be a loving God. He might even be justified in saying, it's most probably not true that there is a loving God when all a woman needed was rain. The idea that God could have a morally sufficient reason for allowing the suffering is a possibility, and that's what causes me to not go so far as Templeton does, as to say there cannot be a loving God. But Kreeft tries to go a bit further, and he actually tries to give us some explanations for the suffering, or for why we should give God a free pass and put our faith in God, saying that, well, we can still trust that maybe he does have a good reason for this, and it kind of fails. Let's go with what he says, this analogy he gives. Look at it this way, he said. Would you agree that the difference between us and God is greater than the difference between us and, say, a bear? Imagine a bear being in a trap, and a hunter who, out of sympathy, wants to liberate him. He tries to win the bear's confidence, but he can't do it. So he has to shoot the bear full of drugs. The bear, however, thinks this is an attack, and the hunter is trying to kill him. He doesn't realize that this is being done out of compassion. Then, in order to get the bear out of the trap, the hunter has to push him further into the trap to release the tension on the spring. If the bear were semi-conscious at this point, he would be even more convinced that the hunter was his enemy who was out to cause him harm and suffering and pain. But the bear would be wrong. He reaches this incorrect conclusion because he's not a human being. Now, how can anyone be certain that's not an analogy between us and God? I believe God does the same to us sometimes, and we can't comprehend why he does it any more than the bear can understand the motivations of the hunter. As the bear could have trusted the hunter, so can we trust God. And as I read that, my heart immediately sank. Because Lee starts off the chapters very well. He demonstrates, he understands the problem of suffering, and then the first answer Kreeft gives is good, and I actually agree with, but this analogy has a lot of problems to it. The hunter is meant to represent God, the bear is meant to represent man, and the trap is meant to represent suffering. So the way the analogy is presented is that the man just sort of stumbles upon a bear caught in a trap in pain and suffering and wants to release him. But this is not at all analogous to the God of the Bible, the kind of God that both Kreeft and Lee Strobel believe in. What would make it a closer analogy would be if the hunter actually trapped the bear himself. If the hunter set the trap and let the bear wander on its own into the trap, and then decided to release the bear from the trap because he had compassion on him. That would be a little closer of an analogy, because God did not stumble upon us in this suffering state. God orchestrated the circumstances to give it the most conservative interpretation, to give it the best interpretation I can give. Not this. I won't say that God caused the suffering, or that God built man in order to suffer. But at best, you have to concede, God constructed a scenario in which man would ultimately step into the trap and suffer. The other problem with the analogy is he describes the bear as being just unable to understand that the hunter is trying to help him, and that is true. But if you take that and look at how the relation between man and God, man may very well also be unable to understand how all this suffering is actually helping us. How, that woman losing her baby is actually helping her in a way, or helping the world. It may be the case. But there's a little tiny detail the analogy leaves out, and that is that God intentionally, according to the Bible, created us without that information. He made us ignorant. He made it to the point so that we can't understand the reason. Whereas he could have made it otherwise. He could have made it so that we do understand the reason. Because apparently he understands the reason. And if he is capable of understanding it, what does he have that we don't, that he could have given us so that we could understand why this suffering is necessary? Now, I suppose you could argue that it is necessary that we don't understand why it's necessary in order for it to be a necessary good. How many times can I say necessary in one sentence? And again, I will give you that is possible, but that's not a reason for me to inspire faith in me. Just because something could be possible does not mean it should be believed. Kreeft goes on in the next section to try and justify our ignorance of why there is suffering. And he has one quote that I kind of like, and it goes like this: Only in a world where faith is difficult can faith exist. That's actually true. I like that. Faith would be meaningless if it were not difficult to some degree. But then he goes on, and he should have left it there. He goes on talking about why we don't have absolute proof of God's existence or the ultimate answer to suffering. If we had absolute proof instead of clues, then you could no more deny God than you could deny the sun. If we had no evidence at all, you could never get there. God gives us just enough evidence so that those who want to can have him, and those who want to follow the clues will. So this is kind of the classic argument of there's just enough evidence for faith or to reject God. And I have always found this argument to be incredibly dishonest. Anyone who reads the Bible should know why this argument is kind of bunk. And the reason being, there are plenty of examples in the Bible of people who knew for absolute certainty that God did indeed exist and chose to reject him or chose to follow him. It did not take away their free will. Probably the best example is what started all this, according to the Bible, Adam and Eve. They knew without question God existed and chose to disobey. So we are not in a position where if we knew God existed, that would somehow take away our free will. Lucifer knew God existed and rebelled against him and turned a third of the angels, according to the Bible, against God, who also knew he existed. There are plenty of times Moses disobeyed God at points, knowing he existed. David disobeyed God at points, knowing he existed, having interacted with him personally. There's just so many examples in the very book, the very holy book that they're representing, that show that that is a flawed argument, to say that if we knew God existed, then we would have no more choice. We could not choose to reject him. The Bible makes it very clear that that is not the case. Before all this in the chapter, Kreeft admitted that suffering was evidence against God. And Strobel jumps in at this point, and his next quote made me laugh out loud. It actually jumped my girlfriend next to me, who, when I laughed at this part, Strobel says this. I'll try to do my best Lee Strobel impression, too. It's probably not very good, but I'll try. Wait a minute! A moment ago, you admitted that something counts against God. That evil and suffering are evidence against him. Aren't you conceding, therefore, that evil disproves God's existence? Case closed! And it actually says, I thumped my hand on the desk. Case closed! When I read that, I just laughed so loud. I just imagined Lee Strobel in the office going, Case closed! Anyway, Kreeft responds with this. No, he insisted, shaking his head. First of all, evidence is not necessarily certain or conclusive. I'm saying in this world there is evidence against and evidence for God. Augustine put it very simply. If there is no God, why is there so much good? If there is a God, why is there so much evil? And I think the answer is because neither one of those things, good or evil, have anything to do with God. Kreeft goes on to try and explain why faith is so powerful to people and how faith is actually a prejudice in people when coming to the conclusion of whether or not God exists and is responsible for suffering or not. And he starts by quoting this. Suppose a policeman came into this room and said they just captured my wife in the act of murdering 13 neighbors by chopping off their heads, and they have witnesses. I would laugh at him. I would say, No, this cannot be. You do not know her as I do, he would say. Where is your evidence? I'd say. It's of a different kind than yours, but there is evidence that this could not be. So I'm prejudiced. However, my prejudice is a reasonable prejudice, because it's based on the evidence I've gathered in my very real experience. So someone who knows God has evidence, and therefore prejudices based on that evidence, which someone who does not know God does not have. Yes and no. I actually impartially agreeing with it. I actually partially agree with Kreeft. I keep saying his name wrong. I actually partially agree with Kreeft here, and that personal experience, experiencing God, knowing God, is probably the best evidence for God. Of course, it's also horribly flawed because people all the time are incorrect about their experiences. But there's one thing in here that kind of strikes me as a bit arrogant, and that is, if a police officer came, he's saying that if a police officer came into his office right now and said, "We've arrested your wife for murder and we have evidence, there's witnesses," he'd be like, "No! Never!" And perhaps that is a warranted immediate reaction, but this happens frequently, actually, that people live with another person or are very close to another person for a long time thinking they know that person, and then it turns out that that person did something horrible or has been doing something horrible that whole time. I won't cite any examples. I think you can think of things, but that kind of thing does happen. And what Kreeft is trying to say here is that because I know my wife so well, there's no possible way that she could have committed this murder. And I just know that, and no amount of evidence will convince me any different. And he's making that analogous to God, saying, I know God, I've experienced God, and there is just no way that he's an evil God for allowing this suffering. He must have a good reason, I think, is the point he's getting at there. And that places a lot of confidence in yourself, in things that you can't actually demonstrate. Now, perhaps it is warranted. I can't say that I have ever experienced God to the point where I just knew him that well. Even when I was a believer, I don't think I would have said that. Maybe I would have. But looking back now, I definitely would not say that. But even if you feel you know God that well, you must take into account that you are a flawed human being who makes mistakes, draws incorrect conclusions sometimes, and could be wrong. If you are unwilling to do that, then you're closed-minded and arrogant. That's all I can say. If you are unwilling to say that you could not have made some kind of mistake here in your impression of what God is, then there's really no reasoning with you. And maybe you're fine with that. But I never wanted to think of myself as a person who was unreasonable on pretty much any topic. Kreeft switches gears here in the next section and brings up a new argument where he says evil can actually be used as evidence for God rather than evidence against him. Consider this, Kreeft said. If Templeton is right in responding to these events with outrage, that presupposes there really is a difference between good and evil. The fact that he's using the standard of good to judge evil, the fact that he's saying quite rightly that this horrible suffering isn't what ought to be, means that he has a notion of what ought to be. That this notion corresponds to something real, and that there is therefore a reality called the supreme good. Well, that's another name for God. Right up until he says, therefore a reality called the supreme good, that's another name for God, I actually agree with him. Templeton is supposing a standard of good and evil. But he is not necessarily supposing a standard of supreme good or supreme evil, or that God is the author of the standard of good and evil. All you need for a standard of good and evil is a mind. And your mind can come up with that standard. Now, you can argue that that's subjective, and you're right. But I would also argue that God's standard is subjective. It's subjective to God. I'll go into that more at another time. But he draws the wrong conclusion here. He leaps from a standard of good and evil to the supreme standard of good and evil must also exist. Just because there is a standard of good and evil does not mean there is a supreme standard of good and evil. Just because I find a pumpkin spice chocolate chip pancake to be better than a regular pancake does not mean that I'm presupposing the existence of an ultimate pancake that has the best flavor of any pancake, that all other pancakes are being judged in comparison to. It's a silly argument to make that just because Templeton has an idea of good and evil that he's come up with. And I think we all come up with our ideas of good and evil. We all have generated that within us. Doesn't mean that he's also presupposing the idea that there is an ultimate standard. It's just thoroughly unimpressive. It's almost embarrassingly unimpressive that this PhD, who has studied this stuff for years and has taught it and has doctorates, is just giving the most silly answers I can think of. A short little quote here that just kind of reinforces what I just said, that this guy really, despite his education, doesn't really seem to know what he's talking about. If there is no creator, and therefore no moment of creation, then everything is the result of evolution. Evolution is the study of life, of biology. I mentioned this in the previous video. It is not an explanation for how the universe began. It just isn't. It's not even an explanation for how life began. Evolution is an explanation of how life changes and grows more complex after life already began, and way after the universe began. And theists never understand that. Not all theists, I shouldn't say theists, I should say Christian fundamentalist apologists never understand that. And Kreeft just demonstrated he's one of them. He doesn't know about evolution the way he should with all his education. And granted, he's not educated in biology, so maybe I'm being a little too cynical here, but you'd think a guy who's spent his life in universities would know that evolution does not account for the creation of the universe. It's just biology. It's just how life changes. He goes on further to demonstrate he does not know what he's talking about with this quote. If there was no beginning or first cause, then the universe must have always existed. That means the universe has been evolving for an infinite period of time. And, by now, everything should already be perfect. There would have been plenty of time for evolution to have finished, and evil to have been vanquished. But there is still evil and suffering and imperfection. That proves the atheists are wrong about the universe. No, Kreeft, that proves you do not understand evolution. Evolution very well could have occurred for an eternity. It didn't because it began when life began on Earth, not when the universe began. The universe could be eternal, and evolution on Earth would still have had a beginning at some point. It wouldn't have been evolving eternally. But even if it was, even if he wasn't completely wrong about eternity and how evolution works, just because evolution's been evolving for eternity doesn't mean it will ever reach something we would call perfection. All evolution does is change in response to surrounding circumstances. That's what natural selection is. If you thought this way about Kreeft, you would have the idea that evolution says we're always getting bigger and stronger and faster. But there are cases when the biggest and strongest does not have the best advantage to survive. If food is scarce, the creatures that are bigger and stronger will not have enough to survive, and the ones that are smaller and weaker and don't require as much nourishment will be able to survive much better. And that's how natural selection works. Evolution isn't working towards perfection. It's not working towards some goal even. It's just changing in response to natural conditions. And Kreeft demonstrates he has no understanding of that whatsoever. He has no concept. He has the wrong concept of what evolution is. Continuing, Strobel says, well, atheism must be an inadequate answer to the problem of evil then, right? And Kreeft goes on saying this, it's an easy answer, maybe, if I may use the word, a cheap answer. Atheism is cheap on people, because it snobbishly says 9 out of 10 people throughout history have been wrong about God and have had a lie at the core of their hearts. Now what he means by that is almost everyone in the world has believed in God, so what the atheist is kind of, I'm above you, I know better than you, and I can see where he would get that from, but he's the same way, and so are you probably. Every person believes 9 out of 10 people are wrong about God, whether you believe in God or not, because almost every person has a different religion than you, comparatively, throughout history, has had a different concept about God. Kreeft is a fundamentalist Christian apologist, and he believes in a certain type of God, the kind of God that is all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, has sacrificed himself as a human being on the cross in the form of his Son Jesus Christ for our sins, all that. And everyone who doesn't believe that, or doesn't believe some of that, is wrong according to him. So he too is in the position of 9 out of 10 people throughout history have been wrong about God. And actually probably more than that, because Christianity, relatively to the amount of time humans and religion have been around, Christianity's been around for a very short time, if you look at it relatively. But he doesn't consider that at all. And maybe he's just making a general statement, but that atheists say no God, Christians say God, or theists say God. Most people are theists, so atheists are arrogant. But he's doing the same thing. If you examine his beliefs any deeper than the surface level of his beliefs, he's doing the same thing. And you probably are too. You probably also believe most of humanity is wrong about God, and you're right. So we're all in that boat together. Continuing. So atheism treats people cheaply. Also, it robs death of meaning. And if death has no meaning, how can life ultimately have meaning? Atheism cheapens everything it touches. Look at the results of communism, the most powerful form of atheism on earth. I'm choosing not to spend 20 minutes explaining why communism and atheism are not the same thing. I'm going to just go ahead and think. I'm going to give you credit that you can figure that out for yourself. But the one thing he does say is that I do want to disagree with is that if death is meaningless, life is meaningless. There is no ultimate purpose to life. And I just disagree with that so much. Even if there is no ultimate meaning to your life or to mine, even if in the long run there will be no ultimate significance to any of us, even if in the long run our sun will collapse on itself and explode, and all of human life and any trace of the earth ever existed will be wiped out. That doesn't mean that there's no meaning to you and me right now. That doesn't mean that you and I don't have significance to ourselves and to others. It's completely belittling a little bit of humanity to say that, well, if you don't have an ultimate purpose, then you have no purpose. We matter now. The things we do and say matter now. And this kind of thinking, I think, is what leads to people not valuing this life, but valuing the next life that they think they're going to have. And not always making the best choices they can in this life, thinking they'll have an eternity to get better or make up for it. But if this life is the only life we have right now, then I think it means more. I think it means vastly more, and is vastly more significant. To know that our time is limited. To know that we won't always exist. And that what we do now has an impact and matters. Rather than thinking we will just always exist. And that's where I'm going to go ahead and end this part of the chapter. We're not even halfway in. Like I said, there's a lot to respond to. So I'm splitting this one up. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I gave you things to think about. And if I did, I hope you will talk with me about it in the comments section, or personally message me, or anything. You can comment me in any way you would like, and get in touch with me and talk about these things. I want to inspire discussion. I want to be corrected if I am wrong, and if I'm getting things wrong or interpreting things incorrectly. So if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, or you can also like my Facebook page, Drunken King 23, and you will also get updates as to when I post videos there. And keep watching, and thank you very much. Please share this video if you liked it, and help get it out there so more people can see it, and perhaps my audience can grow. I would like that very much. Thank you for watching.